The research paper I looked at investigated the relationship between sleep training and cortisol levels in mothers and their infants. The title of the paper that I looked at was Asynchrony of Mother-Infant Hypothalamic Pituitary Adrenal Axis Activity Following Extinction of the Infant Crying Responses Induced During the Transition to Sleep. As we read in Sapolsky's Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, a mother's stress response while she's pregnant can influence the infant's stress response, her offspring's stress response as an infant, all the way through their adulthood. For example, he cited a paper in which the mothers had significantly higher cortisol levels, and then their infants were less sensitive to glucocorticoids. The mother-infant relationship is important in terms of attachment and infant development, and it can be characterized in terms of synchrony between the mother and the child. There are multiple components of synchrony, and two major ones are behavioral and physiological. Middlemiss et al. Recently did a study that looked at how imposing a new sleep schedule or a new sleep routine on an infant would alter the synchrony between the mother and the infant, or cortisol synchrony. The authors had four main hypotheses. The first hypothesis was that the mother and infant would have cortisol levels that were synchronized on the first day of the experiment prior to the infant going to sleep. The second hypothesis was that after the child was put to sleep and not soothed by its mother when it started to cry, both the mother and the infant would have elevated and synchronized cortisol levels. The third hypothesis was that on the third day of the program, the mother and the infant cortisol levels would be synchronized prior to the infant going to bed. And the reason why before going to sleep the cortisol levels are synchronized is because the mother and the infant have spent the day together and have engaged in similar activities and been interacting with each other throughout the day. The fourth hypothesis is that on the third day, after the infant goes to sleep, the mother and infant cortisol levels will not be synchronized. And this is because the mothers will be separated from their infants, who will have learned that crying is not going to have their mothers approach them and soothe them. So the mothers won't be receiving a behavioral indication that their children are stressed, and will therefore have lower cortisol levels than the infants who are actually in distress. There were 25 mother-infant dyads. The infants were 4 to 10 months in age, and they were approximately half of the infants were male. The setting was in a sleep training program in a New Zealand hospital, and at the sleep training program, the infants were supposed to learn how to fall asleep and self-soothe without the presence of their mothers at bedtime. The study lasted 4 days, and there were 3 types of data that were collected throughout the study. Cortisol levels were collected from both the infants and the mothers at the beginning of the sleep routine and 20 minutes after the infant had fallen asleep. Nurses took notes throughout the night on indications of infant distress, such as crying bouts, mostly crying bouts. And then the mothers also completed a survey about their infant's attachment and their anxiety levels. However, the authors did not use this when they drew their conclusions at the end of the study. So, here we have the results of the average cortisol levels. What we can see is that on day 1, before and after sleep, the mother's and the infant's cortisol levels had not changed significantly. Also, on day 3, the infant's cortisol levels did not change significantly from before or at the beginning of their sleep routine to after they had fallen asleep. However, there was a very significant difference between the mother's cortisol levels prior to and after the infant falling asleep. Middlemiss et al. Analyzed these cortisol levels using a Pearson correlation. And what they found was that there were statistically significant correlations between the maternal and the infant cortisol levels before and after infant sleep on the first day. And there were also statistically significant positive correlation between the infant and maternal cortisol levels prior to infant sleep on day 3. Again, this is because, like they predicted, the mothers had spent all day with their infants and therefore have been interacting with them and were in synchrony. However, after infant sleep on day 3, there was no cortisol synchrony between the mothers and the infants. The nurses did note that the infants cried less on day 3, however, that wasn't necessarily because they were in less stress. The authors, as we saw, the infants still had elevated cortisol levels, so the authors said that most likely what had happened was that the infants had learned that crying was not going to encourage their mothers to soothe them, so they decided not to expend that energy and instead experience their stress instead of relaying it to anyone. So there were 2 main conclusions from this study. First is that infant behavior is an extremely important contributor to cortisol synchrony in mother and mother-infant dyads. And also, the authors suggested that as the infants learned to self-settle as they were going to sleep, that their cortisol levels would drop, and then the mothers and infants would be in synchrony again.